while we wait, I didn't put in the agenda, but quick question. These recordings, how about uploading them on YouTube? I can create a channel for Substrate and directly start uploading. That's what I'm doing for other projects. If there is any suggestions, opinions.
I don't think it matters from the website. As long as we have a URL to send people to, it works. So
Yeah,
it sounds like a reasonable.
Sorry, say that again.
Yeah, so it sounds like a reasonable place to put them to me.
Got it. Yeah. Right now, it's a public container which anyone can access on Azure. But we will soon lose access to public containers from Microsoft for security reasons. So, anyways, I have to find a new home, and YouTube might be a good place.
Well, it also has the advantage of being more findable, so people can actually search for it. If we have enough shared access to it, we can do things like update the agenda that was discussed and put in the description, and people could search for particular items. It could be handy.
That's a great suggestion. So what I'll do is I think what in YouTube I can do is I can create a channel and then make multiple people owners. So if using your Gmail accounts, I can add ownership to whosoever the SMC recommends. And I don't need to be an owner. In fact, if you can want to create the account, create it, and then let me know, and I'll keep uploading the videos on the YouTube channel. That's whatever is preferred.
Yeah, if nobody else wants to, I guess I can create the YouTube account. I'll set that up and I'll let you know.
Perfect. Thanks.
All right, let's move on. Weston, you've got the first one.
Sure. So in the read rel, there is a field base schema, and there's also a field projection. And so the question was, does the base schema need to specify every single field that's in the original file? Or is it okay if it just specifies fields that you're interested in reading in? And if so, what is the need for the projection field? I don't know if that was part of the question, but I've added it on, and I have an answer for it as well. But right now on the site one, it says direct schema, which is not the same words as base schema, which is in the file. So it might be nice to fix that anyway. And it says defines the schema of the output of the read before any projection or emit remapping / hiding. So the request is, can we just mention that this doesn't have to be all the columns in the file? And I think the answer should be yes. I think a pretty good argument was put forward, which is if people alter the schema of their data, it should not necessarily invalidate queries, unless they altered the schema of columns that were actually being affected by the query. From a consumer perspective, I don't think this is any particular hardship. It could potentially be one if I guess the question is, if it's not all of the columns, then how does the consumer know which columns it is?
Can you restate that last part? If it's not.
Yeah. It's like if I have a Parquet file with 10 columns and the read rail has a base schema with 5 entries, which of those 10 columns is the user actually wanting? I suppose it seemed more natural looking at the issue originally, since the base schema is named, so there are names there. So assuming the source file also has column names, you could map it that way. But if it doesn't, or if the names are not unique, then that introduces a bit of a problem.
Right. So if you, for instance, if you had, well, I mean, it doesn't matter for CSV, for text, because text doesn't have, it could have no names.
Right.
But almost all the other schemas have names, right? All the other base formats.
Yes, but they don't necessarily require them to be unique names. So like in Parquet, columns have names, but you can have 5 columns named X.
Okay, interesting.
I guess I really didn't think of that until I started saying it out loud. But I don't see how this problem can be overcome necessarily. I mean, you could create a convention. You know, you could say we're going to do name-based matching, or it's always going to be the first however many columns.
Yeah, but first doesn't really solve the problem of being able to add things to the schema, because you don't necessarily always add things at the end.
Right. I will. I wasn't sure if Ingo is going to make it here or not. I'll push back on him to kind of ask, why would you want to do this, and how are you going to work around the mapping issue? Otherwise, I mean, we can speculate why people might want to do this, but I don't think there's much value.
Well, the projection part is, well, I mean, not all consumers support projection. And the purpose of projection is just to save loading things in that you didn't need to load in, right?
Yes. Which, I mean, if you're actually going to deploy anything in production, is pretty essential. Table stakes for performance. Assuming your data is not in like a row-based format.
Yeah. So we've tasted this arrow that.
Yeah, it's, I mean, it's a good sign that no one is, or I would view that as a sign that hopefully no one is actually using Zero protection. But I guess there are some use cases if you always are going to read all of the columns, then it's not such a big deal. But like in Lance, it's pretty much always guaranteed there's going to be some kind of column projection for all of our use cases.
Well, when I read the discussion here, I was just curious about how some engines handle this. I just went just a few minutes ago into the DuckDB shell and just played around with a few queries, and because they notably support just from my table without any projection in the actual SQL. And I was curious, and when I did the explain of the logical plan, they actually do have a projection in there. So the logical plan has a projection of all columns, whether it's select star from my table or from my table. That's just how they happen to implement it. But to make things even more confusing, the physical optimized plan in either case has no projection. So
Yeah, I mean, most read operators, I shouldn't say most because I have not worked on that many query engines, but the read operators that I've seen sort of have an implicit projection. Like you say, I need to read these 3 columns from the file. And so like an extra projection on top of that is not necessary. Or like a read operator can not have a projection to mean read everything. I guess that's one thing. You could omit, you can't really omit the base schema because then no one will know what it is. Yeah. All right, I'll push back. I think it has to be all the columns right now. Otherwise it leads to unknown questions. And if there's a concrete use case for where we can figure out how to do that mapping, then we'll come back. I do think there's some, I think Isthmus does not actually do this right. Might be some of the reason for that. I don't know how Isthmus sets the base schema and the projection if you do a select star. If it maybe it just doesn't push down the projection at all. But I remember it would generate different plans than DuckDB when it came to the read rel base schema and projection.
Yeah, DuckDB likes to have the projections in there in the substrate.
Yeah, it might just be that. I think Isthmus didn't push any projection down into the read rel, and DuckDB always did, even if it was a select star.
Yeah, I guess we can speculate as far as Ingo's use case, but I mean, to me, it does seem valuable in terms of plan portability to be able to tolerate additions of columns in a new environment. Even like kind of these nefarious cases with hidden columns that like depending on like the you go from one system to another and they have like an insertion timestamp or something like that. Maybe that's hidden and that could potentially break the plan even if it's otherwise identical.
I think that's what David ran into in the source issue that raised this.
Yeah.
Other table formats, Iceberg, and I believe Delta introduced the concept of a field ID. So they say that you can have duplicate column names, but every column has an integer ID, and that can never change. That also allows for renaming a column, because then the column ID stays the same. So that might be something we want to investigate if we want Substrate queries to be more invariant to schema evolution. Because even if we did name-based matching, that wouldn't solve, aliases and renames. And you can, if a consumer has, go ahead.
I was just saying like this, there is a discussion, at least in the Iceberg community, about representation of views and for even row level security and how to represent those expressions which are associated with those policies. And there was a mention at that time to use something like Substrate because it can be then enforced by multiple engines uniformly.
Yeah, so if we want to be used by Iceberg, I think we would need to add that. I think at one point I actually made a PR to add it to the Parquet options, but it seems like it's more maybe a universal. Like if a particular consumer doesn't support schema evolution, they can always fall back to column ID is the index of the column in the file. So I don't think it's a burden on systems that don't have a concept of a column ID.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. I guess the trade-off of serializing the plan with column IDs versus column names. Uh, right now, if you especially without, well, I guess it doesn't matter if you have aliasing. If you reference a specific column in a query by name, which is generally how you would in SQL, um, you can figure out what the reference directly with the plan. But if it was actually serialized as IDs, you'd need to consult a catalog in order to. If it was IDs and we've removed the column names, if we had both, then I guess it would be like slightly redundant, but much more precise. But if it's just one or the other with column IDs, then you'd need to refer to some catalog to figure out what the names of each column are going to be, or which index it's referring to when you reference it by name.
I think you need the catalog either way. So if your ReadRail has a name schema that doesn't have all the fields and it just has the names, you still need to know what is the schema of the files that I want to read.
With a file read, yes. I guess with a named table read, realistically in practice, you're almost in like 99% of cases gonna still need the catalog. But in theory, like there's a lot that you could do without a catalog necessarily with the plan if you have all the information in there. Whether that's practically valuable, I'm not actually sure.
Yeah, so without a catalog, so because I prototyped some of this when I was playing around with Substrate and Rust, and I thought there were two kinds of options. There's one, there's absolutely nothing. You don't know how many fields there are. You don't know what their types are. You don't know what their names are. And then two is like you could maybe just know the names, but not the types. Or you could just know the types, but not the names. I think just types, but not names is kind of common. It's what, I don't know if it's common, but it's what Substrate kind of assumes right now. But if you just knew the names, it's like, I don't know. I think most situations are either going to be, I don't know anything, or I know the names and the types, or maybe I just know the types. But I don't know in what situation you would have where you know the column names, but not their types. And field IDs for that matter.
Yeah.
And I think the situation where you don't know anything, you're no worse off with field IDs than you are with names. Not that that's an invalid situation. I think there's still things you could do with it, but it's equally supported with field IDs than it is, or equally unsupported, I should say.
Yeah, I guess I also don't know that field IDs, although more precise perhaps within a specific system, are probably less precise across systems, because that seems like a private implementation detail, and you could have the same data, the same schema, but a different field ID mapping in another system.
Yeah, that's true. I guess you could say, like, if I write a query with field IDs and then I change my schema around a lot, and then I want to run that query again, it's still going to work. But if I take a query that uses field IDs, maybe it's like a TPCH query, and I go migrate to some other system that has the TPCH database stored in there, then it may have a completely different field ID scheme. So now your query is not portable. Whereas if you use names, that query would be portable.
Yeah.
So maybe we can say names and field IDs.
Yeah.
Or the field ID is the name.
And then and then we would be implying that names have to be unique also.
Yeah.
in that case.
All right, let's kick it back for brainstorming and
Yeah.
then move on for this meeting. Maybe.
So I had one here. I've been going through and trying to like wrangle simple extensions into submission in a library that I've been working on. And I've kind of like written, deleted, and rewritten this a few times, kind of getting, I think, the ergonomics a little easier to work with over time. But I asked in Slack last week, I think, about the language for type derivations, for output type derivations. I got some good answers there. But as part of that, I also discovered, I kind of looked at some parts of the protobuf definitions that I hadn't really looked at before. And there's these type expressions and, for that matter, functions. And I just wanted to better understand, I guess, maybe if there's any historical context on those and also how they're meant to be used. Because as far as the process of serializing, deserializing plans to send between producers and consumers, I don't see where either of those would actually end up in a plan, because a lot of that is contained, for example, in the YAML extensions. I propose that it potentially could be useful in an embedded function, but other than that was more like speculative, and I just wondered if those are actually being maintained and consistent, and then like I guess what their purpose is in the specification.
It's a good question. I don't remember the answer, but I feel like this question got asked once before, and the answer was vaguely something along the lines of, oh yeah, I was thinking that would be used for XYZ, but it's not. Like, maybe it was David that asked them. I think these things are just not referenced by any, like if plan and extended expression are the top of your tree, then these messages are unreachable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're unreachable. I have not encountered them in any of my exhaustive top-down uses. So that means that they're usable on the side. So if you wanted to create a derived expression separately, then you could use them. Are they usable with the side expressions? I mean, we have the capability of having a top level expression or something like that that Arrow uses. That's the only place, I don't even think then it could be used. I think they're completely side.
Yeah, I found the question. I'll put it on the chat. I'll see the highlights here. Oops.
So this one's mostly about capabilities, though, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
This is
actually,
a good tag to read. Sorry. I guess some of my interest in this, perhaps that's useful, is as I came across these actually, some writing in Go, so like they're the protobuf and gRPC is handled with code generation, And so I'm kind of like discovering these generated struct types that exist there, and I find the type derivations and things like that. A bunch of stuff that seems unreachable in kind of the normal processes, but what I'm dealing with is like what. So if I wanted to parse one of these simple extension YAML files, what's the target struct look like that I'm parsing it into? And so I can kind of invent my own, or there's also one that's sort of invented in the Substrate Go library right now. I'm kind of like doing a mix of the two, but I'm realizing there's also these generated ones that are kind of a source of truth from the protobuf definitions, and it might, even if it's a problem that they're not used insofar as like it enables drift in the specification as other things move on. And I have noticed some gaps already when working with this, that it's not quite capped. It's clear that it's not in use because someone would have noticed these things if it was in use. So I do think it could be valuable. I think but it is difficult to justify it and to keep it accurate while it's not bearing any load in any real systems because there's not any scrutiny on it. So those are just my thoughts when working with it. But given that, I was curious about the context, and that looks like that thread has some good information on it.
Yeah. There is one other source of truth, which is the YAML schema.
I did see that. Yeah.
That's what I've used for my own, but I think the BFT does the parsing of YAMLs. I think it just does ad hoc created structures. Like I don't think it does code generation.
Okay. Another thing that I did look at as I was looking at the protobufs is there are tools actually that will generate a JSON schema, but similar enough from protobuf definition. So if we did want to have one source of truth, because there's definitely an overlap, not even just overlap, like in a sense they're defining the same exact thing, but slightly differently. But if we did keep the protobuf as the source of truth, which again is awkward because it's not load bearing right now, but also it kind of conceptually maybe consolidates the substrate specification to like just protobuf rather than like YAML files and things like that. But we could generate those schemas and validators downstream of protobuf also.
Yeah, so YAML schema is JSON schema. It just reused it. So if you can generate that, then I'd be happy to, push that through on the main repo. And then it becomes load bearing because the YAML schema is actually run on every single commit to validate the YAMLs, the standard YAMLs that are in there. So if you were able to connect to that, I think you solved the problem of the protobuf not being load bearing.
Okay, that's good to know. I guess then maybe I'll take a look at that. I'll play around and I'll perhaps put together PR, and maybe we can discuss there if that's the direction that we want to go. I think that's all from me on that one.
I can bring up my topic next. Yeah, I think one of the community syncs a little while ago, we talked a little bit about the BFT and possibly donating it to Substrate. And I think at the time there's still like a lot of like bugginess going on, but I think now it's kind of more ready to. So I just wanted to maybe kick off that process, and I don't know what that process is like. So
I think we would just need confirmation from all, basically the owning organization, Voltron Data, and all committers. Whoever owns the copyright needs to confirm that it's legit to copy it over. And then I think we just make the new repo. Like in the Apache projects, there's a template. I can find it and we can see if we can get it filled out. I think the Apache template too is like best effort. It's like try and get some signatures from the different committers, but I think it's for like external open source things. Since this wasn't really open source, I think all the copyright and everything is just owned by Voltron Data. So as long as there was some kind of sign off.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. I think that should be pretty simple. Maybe a bit lengthy, but it should be simple.
Let's just put it on the mailing list, and that way everyone can chime in. But I mean, I guess we could have a vote to decide if we want to accept it, but I'm all for it.
Okay, yeah, sure, sounds good to me. We can, yeah, the mailing list might be a good idea so that everybody knows, as opposed to just us four on this call.
And if once that's done, I think it would be good to update the main site and kind of make that like authoritative documentation for functions in a way.
Mm.
Both, it would help because Substrate doesn't have a lot of function documentation, and it would help, like I think the BFT get more attention in that now people will see this as a Substrate, like an extension of Substrate, and not necessarily a separate cataloging effort.
Yep. Yeah, I think, yeah, I think that's a good idea. But there is still a little bit of there still might be a little bit of disconnect between like functions and the available options though. And I don't think there's still definitely a bunch more functions that Substrate has that hasn't been, I guess, ported into BFT for testing yet either.
I think that's fine.
Yeah, this is still SQL. This is still the SQL behavior of the engines, not the substrate behavior of the engine.
Yep.
Well, a function's behavior is not SQL or Substrate. It's what does add mean?
Yeah. Yeah, but add may have some options or different set of parameters or the way it's connected up.
Yeah, like how you invoke the add operation is a Substrate question.
Yeah, I mean, I could see or, for instance, being binary, a binary operator in Substrate, but multiple, taking multiple things in SQL or vice versa. Or this all possibilities of difference, behavior differences.
I think when it comes to number of arguments, we would want the two to be in sync. So
We would like that, but I don't necessarily believe that everybody's Substrate adapters are consistent.
Right. I think, well, that's almost a separate problem, I think. I mean, there's the problem of is the BFT Substrate or SQL, which I don't think it's either. I think it's just defining the semantics of the functions. And then there's the problem of is a particular Substrate implementation, and by extension here, a BFT implementation of a function doing the right thing. Like OR has two common, there's two different behaviors for OR. I think in Arrow it's OR and clean OR. One of them is how it has to do with nulls. So it's like, is one or null, or is it one? So I think that's something that the BFT would define and list test cases. But when it comes to to-arg versus in-arg, I think BFT and Substrate need to be in agreement there. I think those are two different functions from both a Substrate and a BFT point of view if it's a var arg versus a limited number of args.
Yeah, and I think through adding more test cases to the BFT, we've been able to align it better too, because I've been finding a lot of like different options that are available that weren't documented in Substrate, and I've been adding them as well.
And I guess I would say, if you're testing the BFT on like Postgres, and let's say Postgres supports a var args or, and Substrate defines it as it takes into. I think that's still legitimate.
Ceros, the Substrate defines as var args, and Cero says, sorry, I only handle 2. Or is it data fusion? But yeah, one of the consumers says I only handle 2. So it's the right signature. It just rejects some.
I think in that case, the correct documentation for the BFT would be to say that Cero does not support the OR function. And they could make like an OR2 function or something like that, but
I guess the relationship to, from my perspective, I don't know that much about the BFT, but I guess the relationship to Substrate, whether I guess Substrate is a first class consideration in the BFT or not, comes to mind, like, because binary OR and variadic OR are 2 different function signatures, and they could just arbitrarily be defined in 2 different simple extension files. And so I guess, is the BFT defining a canonical set of simple extensions as a source of truth? Because like it seems like you could evaluate those tests for any potential set of extension files might have different signatures and get different results.
Source of truth for the BFT is the Substrate YAMLs that are in substrate.io /substrate. So I think it's actually impossible for the BFT to define a function that is not in those YAMLs.
Okay.
Because it's all code generation at the moment, just stitching together various pieces of information.
Okay, that's good to know.
I agree there is some fuzziness if you use the BFT for, like, there's one portion of the BFT which is here. So it says, here's a function that comes from Substrate. And then it says, here's how a bunch of different engines support that function. And that is not necessarily using Substrate. So right now it could say Postgres does or does not support the function OR, even though there is no Substrate adapter for Postgres. In a sense, the code for the BFT is a tiny little Substrate adapter for very simple plans that just do select star project function name, run. So it's like the BFT itself is its own tiny little, has a bunch of little consumers in there and those all could be potentially making decisions. So like the BFT could choose, is it valid to map the to-arg version of OR into Postgres's in-arg version, or is it valid to map, or whatever. And then there's also another like class of decisions made in there, which like when a test case fails, is it a bug in the implementation? Is it the implementation does not support that function, or is it the implementation does not support some option? those things have to get kind of defined and ironed out. So there is non-substrate ground truth in there, but it's unrelated to the, like it's in addition to the substrate ground truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess there was a discussion a few meetings back about whether the substrate simple extensions are special in some regard, and I think it's interesting from that perspective because, in theory, every data system has its own like theoretical set of extensions that overlap to some degree with the standard substrate ones, but likely none of them overlap 100%. And so it's kind of helpful to think about what the substrate ones are meant to do. And one thing that came up that I think is interesting is like it's not perhaps meant to be like correct or like prescriptive in any way, but maybe like it's like an intermediate representation target for implementations to target. And I don't know that this has been done or been devised in any way, but then like from those functions, like what are the patches? What's the diff between those and like Postgres? And then actually like create a definition for like conversion from standards from like the canonical substrate representation to Postgres, which might mean recast this as that or whatever. And ideally, that substrate representation minimizes the patches across the ecosystem. That's of course intractable to find that exact definition, but maybe as a goal, I think.
The original goal of the BFT was to define those patches.
Okay.
It is to build up a large enough set of test cases that you could strap on an engine, run it through all the test cases, and figure out where the inconsistencies are.
Interesting. Is there anywhere that the test outputs and inconsistencies are uploaded, or do you have to run the test suite yourself?
The inconsistencies, so basically there's test cases and then there's dialect files.
Mm-hmm.
And if the dialect file does not match the test case, it's a CI failure. So if, for example, Postgres didn't support add, you would have to put in the dialect file add not supported.
I see. Okay.
And so then that dialect file becomes an artifact in and of itself that others could programmatically consume to try and build up those transformations.
I see. Interesting. Okay, I'm looking at this now.
There's a lot of work to be done before you get to the point where you could actually do that. But that was the thinking, would be that's the dialect files are an artifact of themselves that are CI tested on a regular basis.
Interesting. So the idea is what, like, given the dialect files and the documented exceptions within them, these tests pass currently in CI. Okay, cool.
But it gets tricky. Like floating point tests commonly fail with Postgres because Postgres has very strange ideas of truncation and rounding. Like it likes to round everything to 6 precision or 6 digits, which is not IEEE floating point. So it's like, so what do you say then? That just Postgres doesn't support. I think right now it says Postgres does not support any functions involving doubles, which is misleading. So it's like, how do you define a dialect file that's able to communicate that information? I don't think that answer is figured out yet. And like SQLite should in theory kind of fail everything because it doesn't have, like add in SQLite will silently upcast from an integer to a float if it has integer overflow, which is completely in violation with Substrate. But what do you say? Do you say SQLite does not support numbers? In which case the dialog file is not terribly useful.
Interesting.
Perfect for my text-only database use.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, we're gonna have to upload when we bring it in. We're gonna have to upload all that stuff somewhere.
I think it's hosted with GitHub Pages, so we should get that automatically. Just the URL will change.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think generally people have been okay about accepting this, at least from whatever discussion a couple months back. The last thing is there's a PR out there that I haven't looked at yet, which is adding a blog section to the site. And I was wondering what people were thinking about that. I don't know if anybody else has looked at it either.
I think that'd be cool. Does anyone have any ideas for a first blog post so it's not empty?
There's a sample one in there for change that Alessandro put in.
Okay, cool.
But I'm not so sure I want people using a Python function that wraps a one-liner to load the plans in from a protobuf.
I could write one about, like we recently added support for arrow specific types to the PyArrow to Substrate converter. So I could maybe write a short little blog post about like how that allowed us to do push down from polars. Because polars in the past, I don't think they do it anymore, but they were using large string for everything. I think now they use string view for everything. So without the ability to do a large string representation of Substrate, we couldn't do push down. And actually we can handle string view too, because string view from Substrate's perspective is just a encoding and not an actual type. So the PyArrow converter will convert string view to Substrate string.
Does it do that with type variations or?
It does not. It just pretends it's a string and it does not round trip.
Okay.
In Arrow C++, I basically said, if the domain of the two types is identical, so for every value X in type A, you can convert to a value B in type B, or a value Y in type B, and then the inverse of y is x, then those are encodings and not separate types. And we don't record anything. We pick one to be primary, and we don't record anything in the as a variation or anything like that. Because I wasn't entirely sure if that was, I don't know, like I believe those from Substrate's perspective, string view versus string is an implementation detail. Like functions do not behave differently. You know, the only place where it might matter, which is not technically defined by Substrate, is if you want to export data. Substrate does not necessarily tell you what the format of the data is. Like it could be an arrow table with a bunch of types, and then you'd have to pick at that point, do I want to use string or string view to represent this to the producer I'm sending to? But Substrate says that's to be negotiated beyond the plan. Because it could also be a CSV file, you know, that you or Parquet.
We need a write plan or a write rel of some sort. Well, we have write rels, but
Yeah, there's a write rel.
But the write
But
rel
that's
doesn't,
right into the database,
Yeah.
not right out of it.
yeah.
and it doesn't, like it could be a write into a row-based format, like MySQL, or it could be a write into a columnar format, and you know, it would be fine. Just so, like in my point of view, it's not necessarily something that has to go in Substrate. Like if I have a consumer, I have one method which says execute plan, and I have a second argument which is like output schema, and the plan tells me what to do, and the output schema tells me how to format the output. Or, you know, if we want to get really fancy, you don't even give it an output schema, and you let the consumer pick whatever is most appropriate to represent the data. Maybe this particular column is really suitable for run length encoding, and so it puts it in a run length encoded thing, and you don't get a consistent schema. But no one ever likes that, so probably wouldn't actually do that.
Yeah, I think the Spark folks or gluten folks would probably be, oh, we really want an output schema in our root. And so if you actually put the output schema in the root, it could define what that oh, this is a string view on the way out.
But it's a can of worms, because then it's like, is it an arrow string view? Is this a, you know, I think at one point Velox had a slightly different way it encoded string view. Trying to remember what the difference was. I think it was something like how many bytes do you use for the header of the string?
And you would have version differences. Is it string view 1 or is it string view 1.1 or?
Yeah.
Well, I think my understanding is the canonical way that, I don't know that anyone actually implemented this, but the way that Substrate handles this now is you'd need a function that translates from, that has the signature of string type variation 0 to string type variation 1, and then register type variation 1 as string view, whatever. And then that would be the portable way to do it. But again, I don't know that anyone.
The advantage of doing that would be that you could round trip. So I could say, oh, I need to represent, maybe like, let's say DuckDB wanted to push down a filter into Acero. And it also wanted, for some reason, to push down, I really want you to use string view or read this, you know, column as string view or something like that. But yeah, I forget what the original question was. I think we're off in the weeds.
I realized I'll just drop this link here. This is something that I've been working on, kind of what I was referring to with some of the questions. Probably have more, but it's like I finally open sourced it because I pulled it out of it was embedded in a private repo before. I couldn't think of a good name, so I just called it Bonobo.
Cool.
It's very early, and like probably pretty significant things will change, like especially as I figure out simple extensions and how they map more natively into here. But there's some decent examples of like some very, very simple SQL to Substrate without needing JVM or anything like that. So a few things planned but that's what I've been working on recently with this.
Thanks for sharing.
So everyone, yeah. So if you have any thoughts, reach out, and yeah, I'm sure you'll be hearing more about this.
Nice.
I have to drop to my next thing. Bye, everyone.
All right. Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.